The morning she noticed it, she thought something was wrong with her cattle. They were all standing at the same fence, not at the feed trough, not under the shade trees, not near the water. Every single one of them was staring toward one particular field. And what was growing in that field? Sunflowers. She had planted them only weeks earlier, and she had no idea that those bright yellow flowers would completely change the way her cattle behaved. At first, she ignored it. But then something happened that made her stop what she was doing. One of her oldest cows walked away from the herd, crossed nearly the entire pasture, and stood beside the sunflower field for almost 10 minutes. She wasn't eating. She wasn't grazing. She was simply standing there, staring at the plants, and then the other cattle followed. The strange behavior continued for days. The farmer, Sarah, had been raising cattle on her family farm for more than a decade. She knew her animals. She knew when they were hungry. She knew when they were stressed. She even knew when a cow wasn't feeling well just by watching the way it walked. But this was different. Every morning, the cattle seemed unusually interested in the sunflower field. Some would gather along the fence. Others would walk back and forth beside it. And whenever the wind moved the tall sunflower heads, the cattle became even more attentive. Sarah began wondering, what were they seeing? What were they smelling? And why were they suddenly so attracted to that field? At first, her neighbors laughed when she mentioned it. They told her the cattle probably just liked the shade. Someone even joked that the cows had developed expensive taste. But Sarah wasn't convinced. So she decided to investigate. She started by looking at the plants themselves. The sunflowers were growing surprisingly well. Their stems were tall and strong, their leaves were broad, and the flowers were beginning to mature. But Sarah noticed something else. The sunflower field was attracting life. Bees were everywhere. Butterflies moved between the flowers. Small birds landed on the seed heads. And underneath the plants, insects were constantly moving through the soil. The field seemed completely alive. Then Sarah noticed something she hadn't considered before. Her cattle weren't simply attracted to the sunflowers. They were attracted to everything around them. The insects, the smell, the fresh vegetation, the activity. The entire ecosystem around that field was different. But Sarah still wanted proof. So she decided to conduct a simple experiment. She opened a section of the pasture farther away from the sunflower field and placed fresh grass there. The cattle barely reacted. Then she opened another section closer to the sunflowers. Almost immediately, several cows walked toward it. That was when Sarah became even more curious. She began spending more time observing them. And what she discovered surprised her. The cattle were not only spending more time near the sunflowers, they were grazing differently. They moved more slowly. They spent longer periods searching through the grass. And instead of staying concentrated in one part of the pasture, they began moving around much more naturally. Sarah realized that the sunflower field had unintentionally become the center of a small ecosystem. The tall plants provided shelter. Their flowers attracted pollinators. Their seeds attracted birds. Their leaves created shade close to the ground. And the roots interacted with the soil in ways that could improve its structure and organic activity over time. But there was still one question. Could the cattle actually eat the sunflowers? Sarah wasn't about to let her animals consume an unknown plant without checking first. She contacted an agricultural specialist and explained what she had observed. The answer was more complicated than she expected. Sunflowers can be used in livestock systems, including their seeds and certain plant residues, but they need to be managed properly. Too much of anything can create problems. And Sarah's cattle didn't actually need to eat the flowers for the field to benefit the farm. That changed the way she looked at the experiment. She had planted the sunflowers thinking they were simply another crop. Now she was seeing them as part of a larger farming system. And then came the biggest surprise. As the weeks passed, Sarah noticed that the soil around the sunflower field was staying covered. Instead of bare ground being exposed to the sun and heavy rain, plant material was covering the surface. She also noticed more insects, more birds, and more activity around the field. The farm looked different. It felt different. And her cattle seemed to notice it before she did. By the end of the season, Sarah had learned something important. Sometimes a farmer changes one small thing without realizing how many other things that change can affect. She had planted sunflowers. The sunflowers attracted insects and birds. The vegetation changed the environment. The environment changed how the cattle used the pasture. And suddenly, a simple $55 experiment had turned into one of the most interesting lessons she had ever learned on her farm. But Sarah wasn't finished. The following year, she planted an even larger sunflower strip. This time, she wasn't watching the flowers. She was watching the cattle. And on the first morning the herd was allowed back into that pasture, something happened that made her smile. The cows walked straight toward the sunflower field, just like they had the year before. Sarah stood by the fence and watched them. She finally understood that they weren't necessarily chasing some mysterious attraction. They were responding to a landscape that had become richer, more active, and different from the rest of the pasture. And that was the lesson she never forgot. Sometimes the biggest changes on a farm don't begin with expensive machines. They begin with one small experiment, one unusual idea, and the willingness to watch closely enough to notice what happens next. Because while Sarah thought she was simply planting sunflowers, her cattle were teaching her something about the farm she had never seen before.